Today, we're really lucky to have Evan Mawdsley with us from Glasgow. He's spending his evening with us, even though we're spending our early afternoons, as the case may be. Evan's is a well-respected Russian historian. He taught at the University of Glasgow. He's since retired, and he's moved into naval and maritime history since then, which shows you that it's never too late to take up the study of naval and maritime history. Um, Evan has written several books recently. I think the book of most interest to us is the World War II at Sea, which I've read and which I can recommend highly. And I think, Evan, you're going to talk about that just a little bit, I hope. I also want to note that Evan was the winner of the Anderson Medal for Naval History for 2020, which is presented by the Society for Nautical Research in the United Kingdom. And so that's a fairly large honor. So congratulations, Evan, for that. We're very pleased for you. We have some special guests from Europe as well. We have Daniele Sapienza, who is coming in from the Ufficio Storia Marina Militare. So we're very pleased that we're starting to get some attention from overseas as well. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to this presentation, Evan, so I better stop talking and let you take it over. So go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Everyone can hear me, right? First of all, Happy New Year. Secondly, thanks a lot to Vince for inviting me to give a talk to the Western Naval History Association, and I've heard the last two or three, and they've all been really, really interesting with great discussion. Anyway, just to say a bit of background, I am British, born in England, but I spent most of my career in Scotland. My father moved to New York to work, and I had most of my general education in the US, hence my mid-Atlantic Long Island accent. Let me know if you can't understand anything I'm saying, but I hope things will be okay. The talk, basically, Swan Song, is a particular word. It kind of implies the end of something. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, swan song is a song like that fabled to be sung by a dying swan, the last work of a poet or musician composed shortly before his death, hence my final performance, action, or effort. Well, I did not really talk about the death of the Royal Navy. I think that's not how I'm seeing the word swan song. The Navy, in fact, survived the war. It's still going strong. I'm just showing you a picture of HMS Queen Elizabeth, which just last week had become the core of a new British carrier strike group. So in Britain, in that respect, is still in business. And after the war, even in 1945, into 1950s, Britain was still the second biggest navy in the world. It's played an important role in the Cold War. But since 1944-45, there's always been a very big jump between the preeminent navy in the world, the United States Navy, and all the secondary navies, which now includes the Royal Navy. So I'm seeing this partly as an end of British naval supremacy, rather than an end of the Royal Navy. I'd like to stress too that although I'm going to be talking a lot about the Royal Navy and its role, I'm not trying to be critical of the United States Navy. And I'm currently writing a book about the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 under Admirals Spruance and Mitchell from January to August 1944, which I hope to finish this year or next, COVID-19 permitting. And I'm doing that because it's kind of the opposite from what I'm talking about tonight. It is the point at which and how the US overtook the British Empire as a global sea power during that period. I think precisely in the period from the beginning of 1944 until the middle of the year. Anyway, what I am going to say is based on the book, which Vince kindly mentioned, The War for the Seas. And it's a book which I published in 2019. It's available in hardback, paperback. It's also an audio book. So if you have a chance, you might want to have a look at it. What it says, it really is a discussion of the Second World War at sea. It's not, strictly speaking, a naval history in a narrow sense. And the subtitle, A Maritime History of World War II, gives some indication of what I was trying to do when I wrote the book as well, making a distinction between maritime history and naval history, thinking of maritime history as maritime power, involving shipping, trade links, all kinds of other intangible things like that that give a state very considerable power. And so the maritime element is something that I'll be talking about later on today, but it's one of the things that I try to talk about in the book. The other characteristic of the book, aside from the focus on maritime power as opposed to just narrowly naval power, is that I'm trying to think in terms of what I call sea air power, sea/air power, because it seems to me that in the Second World War, when one is talking about sea power, one is talking about power on the surface of the sea, under the sea, but above all, obviously, over the sea in the terms of air power. This direct link between the two types of warfare. And in particular, the way in which this involves the really knotty problem of inter-service cooperation, the idea that the importance of mixing together, especially air and naval power, bureaucratically is very complicated and very interesting. And it's something that I try to develop in the book. So those are really the kind of features that I am talking about in terms of what I would say are features of the book in terms of the nature of sea power in the Second World War. But the other side of it is, what are some of the central arguments of the book, which you may or may not agree with. But I was trying to make this more than simply a list of operations and a list of events. And one of the events, one of the ways of looking at the actual deployment of navies during the Second World War is the difference between what I would call the Atlantic European theater and the Pacific theater. And the argument that I take, which not everyone would obviously would agree with, is that the war in the Atlantic was more important than the war in the Pacific. And I think the reason why that kind of goes against common sense or accepted wisdom is that the war as a naval war, the war in the Pacific is clearly is more spectacular. The biggest naval action in the European Atlantic War was probably the Bismarck sortie in May of 1941, and it only involved 2 ships on the German side. In contrast, in the Pacific War, there were 3 full-scale fleet actions involving both the Japanese, more or less the entire Japanese and American fleets were deployed in all these 3 actions. And there were 3 more naval battles which involved capital ships, aircraft carriers or battleships. So in terms of the actual level of combat, of great battles, there's clearly much more going on, it would seem, in the Pacific than in the Atlantic. And yet, in contrast to that, it seems to me that from the point of view of grand strategy and from the perspective of the 1940s, Nazi Germany was far more dangerous for the Allied cause than was Imperial Japan. Hitler might have been able to knock Britain out of the war by invasion or by forcing the government in London after blockade or bombing to conclude a negotiated peace. With Britain out of the war, a challenge to German Axis hegemony in Europe and the Mediterranean would have been extremely difficult. My intention is certainly not to belittle the American contribution, both before and after December 1941 in the Second World War. The industrial power and massed armed forces of the United States were essential to mount any effective counterattack. against Germany in the West. However, this counterattack could only be achieved if there were bases on the periphery of continental Europe that could be held and supplied. Control of these bases demanded the ability of the Allies to control the North Atlantic transport routes. In contrast, the East-West Trans-Pacific route was, in the war years, of little economic importance. Japan, despite its large population, was also, in the 1940s, much weaker economically, technically, and militarily than Germany was. It was evident that once Germany and Italy were defeated, Japan would have no chance to hold out against a heavily armed global super coalition involving the British Empire, the USA, the USSR, and we often forget China. So I'm saying that this leads me to a sense that the German war is more important than the Japanese war. What happens in the Atlantic-European war is more important than that happens in the Pacific, in grand strategic terms, not necessarily in terms of naval history. So that's one of the basic arguments that I make in the book, that it is taking the war in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in general in Europe, as being really important. But the corollary of that is that the contribution of the British Empire to the Allied victory in the Maritime War deserves rather more credit than it's often accorded. There's no doubt that the outcome of the war, despite the defeat of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, was in all but the short term a severe setback for Britain. The factors involved were very wide-ranging, including the economic burden of victory, the inability to maintain imperial control from 1947 onwards, the impact of nuclear weapons. The Royal Navy in particular never recovered from the losses suffered at the hands of the Germans and the Japanese, nor caught up with the astonishing warship construction program of its great American ally. In addition to that, by the 1950s, the British merchant marine and civilian shipbuilding industry were in steep decline, ironically, partly caused by Japanese competition. But what I would say is that to project that weakness back before 1944 and 1945 would be misleading. It would be a mistake to see things too much from hindsight and from what were the negative results for Britain, even of victory in the Second World War. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my presentation. And there are two aspects to that, looking at British performance during the war. One of them is about preparation for war. How ready was Britain to go to war in 1939? And the second, what did Britain and the Royal Navy and British maritime power actually do in the war? What was its importance? And I'm looking at this concept of Britain and its readiness for war. One of the concepts, one of the notions which historians use, not just naval historians, but historians of Britain's economy and so on, use the concept of declinism. Declinism being that Britain's trajectory is in decline. It's entering a position of going into war in a much weaker position than it had been before. And for a number of reasons, I think this is exaggerated, and there's a considerable school of thought now, which could be called anti-declinism, looking at the strengths of the empire. And I think I would probably agree with that, both economically, politically, and also militarily. And my argument in general would be that Britain enters the war in 1939 in a considerable position of strength. Some of the reasons are obvious. Britain is at that time still a global empire. And this is a map of the situation, broadly speaking, as it was in 1939. It controls large territories outside the UK, which are important. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India, which has a position of a dominion, huge population base. It controls most of the choke points of world trade: Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Aden, the Cape of Good Hope, Ceylon, Singapore, the Falkland Islands, the Cape Horn, and so on. All of these are largely controlled by British outposts, which gives it an enormous kind of base. The empire itself is a huge base for British power. In 1939, the British Empire is the largest political entity on the planet, with a population of 530 million and an area of 13 million square miles. In contrast, the population of Germany in 1938 was 75 million, with an area of 220,000 square miles, a much smaller area. And Britain had a gross domestic product about twice that of Germany. So I think you have to see things as they were then to understand both how the British saw themselves and what happens during the war. I would stress that I'm not making a defense of imperialism here. I'm just saying that this is the way the balance of power actually worked out in 1939. So empire gave Britain an enormous advantage in terms of its operations. It also had the disadvantage that Britain was vulnerable on a number of fronts and would face a great, as we all know, a great challenge in 3 or 4 major areas. A second area of strength was in Britain's merchant navy, which I think, again, can often be forgotten in thinking about war in purely naval terms. Britain's merchant marine gave it a unique power base in 1939 in terms of a huge fleet of cargo and passenger ships. What the image that I think you can see in front of you, I hope, is a Union Jack flag. It's a poster and postcard from the 1930s. Empire marketing is the way in which the empire and trade fit together. But it's, I think, really a nice image for how the empire and how the British merchant navy worked together as a source of strength, both before the war and once the war begins. But it is the case that Britain does have this enormous advantage in terms of merchant tonnage. In 1939, the merchant ship tonnage of the British Empire is almost 18 million tons GRT, out of a world total of 68 million tons. That's, roughly speaking, a quarter of world tonnage is British. At that time, the USA possessed the second largest merchant fleet, but it amounted to only about 11 million tons. And the fleet of Britain's 1939 ally, France, had a fleet of only about 3 million tons. So it's a huge advantage. Britain also at that time had a shipbuilding industry with special strength. It's weaker than it was before the First World War, when about a third of world's merchant shipping was built within 5 miles of where I live in Glasgow. But even so, in the 1920s and 1930s, about 40% of world merchant shipping was still built in British shipyards. Production in 1938 was almost 1 million tons of shipping. And by comparison, in the following year, 1939, American shipyards delivered only about a third of that, something like 341,000 tons. So Britain was beginning from a position of really quite enormous power in that respect. And I would add, in addition to that, that not only was Britain strong before the war began, but once the war began in 1939, actually the British merchant marine became bigger because it was able to incorporate the merchant navies, merchant marines of most of the states that were overrun by Germany, and it was able to lease other forms of shipping. So by the time you get into 1940-41, the British have about 4 million tons more shipping than they had in 1939. So this is a part of their strength. And then the other element is the construction of warships. It's hard to accept the view that declinism can apply to the strength of the Royal Navy in warships, despite the fact that it's obviously not as strong as it was in 1914, when its position was preeminent. But in my view, it's hard to use the word declinism to apply to British naval power and to suggest that the Royal Navy slept through or ignored reality in the interwar years. One eminent historian, Paul Kennedy, who's now based in the U.S., described these as years of decay. Another British historian, Corelli Barnett, cited 20 years of national illusion and neglect. He was talking about naval power and other kinds of military power. The reality is that Britain entered the First World War in 1918 with much the largest navy in the world, and it maintained this position for the following 2 decades. It's two of its major enemies, Russia and Germany, ceased to have significant fleets after 1918, 1919. Britain did have to scrap modern ships at the time of the Washington Treaty in 1922, and it accepted levels of battleships and cruisers at Washington and London that were the same as the United States. But it seems to me this was, Britain was certainly holding its own. It built a very large fleet of cruisers to patrol the empire. It had a carrier program in 1939 that was larger than the American carrier program. So in many respects, it was very strong. And the ships you can see in front of you at the Coronation Review in 1937 include modernized battleships, treaty cruisers, 10,000-ton cruisers, and in the form of the battleship Rodney in the foreground, the most modern battleship in the world. Rodney and Nelson were built 5 or 6 years after any other capital ship, and they were able to incorporate many of the lessons learned at Jutland. The one weakness of the British naval sea air power in 1939, it seems to me, then and thereafter, and it's not really a decline, was a problem of carrier aircraft and land-based naval strike aircraft. And that, I think, is largely the fault of the Royal Air Force, not of British decline, because the RAF controlled Royal Navy procurement and doctrine formally until 1937, and in practice until the war began. And I think that was a fundamental weakness of the Royal Navy compared to either the the US Navy or to the Imperial Japanese Navy. To be fair, however, the RAF did eventually develop and procure highly effective maritime patrol aircraft that made it a crucial part of the Allied victory in the Second World War. So that's the kind of basis for going into the war. I'm arguing that in most respects, Britain was quite strong and had a number of advantages over almost everybody else in the world. It was this enormous empire. I think if you don't see the war from that starting point, it's hard to understand really what the war was about and what advantages that Britain had and why the fall of France in 1940 wasn't being all that critical. So that's the first part of the story. The second part is what actually happens, the conduct of the war after September 1939, the actual swan song, as it were. If you look at operations under the British during these years, I suppose one thing you have to say is that the British role in the war against Japan was very limited. The two exceptions to that were at the very beginning and at the very end of the war. At the very beginning with Force Z, when the British attempted to deploy a major force to Singapore, and the Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by the Japanese. And at the very end of the war, when another British squadron, the British Pacific Fleet, was deployed off Okinawa and Japan, with this time a very modern fleet, able to play a considerable role in operations in the last months of the war. So obviously the gap is in this major war against Japan. And I would say that what happens when Britain is not involved in the war with Japan is that America creates this huge navy to deal with the Japanese challenge. As I mentioned before, the first half of 1944 is when the fast carrier fleet comes on stream. And between January 1944 and the middle of 1944, at least on paper, the American Navy is now superior in almost all respects, certainly in terms of large surface ships and carriers, to the Royal Navy. And that, as I say, is what I want to write about next. However, in other respects, the British contribution is enormous. I'm just going to skim through these because it's just hitting the highlights. If you want to know more, you have to go out and read the book. But from Norway onwards, the British are playing a crucial role. Norway's, the first 9 months of the war don't go well. Britain loses 2 fleet carriers and a battleship. But the campaign off Norway, although it's not a successful campaign in the long term, is very important because although Britain suffers losses, the Germans also suffer losses in damaged and sunk ships, which means that in the crucial end of 1940, beginning of 1941, the forces available to fight Britain are strictly limited. Dunkirk, which comes in May of 1940. Again, the Royal Navy is crucial in taking off the British Expeditionary Force from the ports of northern France. That is, by the way, an operation carried out not by pleasure craft and tugboats, but by destroyers and transport ships of the Royal Navy. Some of the same ships that moved the British Expeditionary Force to France also got them out again. Rather to everyone's surprise, in May of 1940. The episode of the Battle of Britain, in the battles of the summer and autumn of 1940, are generally seen, I think, in America, but also here, as a victory won by fighter command and by the Royal Air Force. But again, it seems to me that ultimately the reason why Germany didn't invade Britain in the summer of 1940 was that it virtually had no navy left to fight, and it was facing a much superior Royal Navy. Whether invasion was possible, one could argue about, but certainly the view of the German Navy was that an attempt to invade would be suicidal. And I think Hitler came to the same conclusions at about the same time when he decided to turn on Russia as he thought an easier challenge. So I think that's certainly an area where the Navy is to some extent underrated. Another area is an amphibious warfare. In a sense, by the time we get to the autumn of 1940, there's a kind of stalemate. Germany can't invade Britain. Britain can't invade the continent. But the British do begin a campaign of combined operations, amphibious landings in the more exposed parts of the new German Empire. And the so-called raiding strategy is rolled out in the later part of 1940 and the beginning of 1941. The first serious combined operation of the entire Second World War for the Allies is the attack on the Lofoten Islands west of Narvik in Norway in March of 1941. And what you're seeing here is a group of British troops coming ashore. They are in a modern landing craft with a bow door. You can see it on the left. But it's a raid. They don't stay for very long. They burn some tanks of fish oil. But it's nevertheless the first time at which the Allies undertake a successful landing in German territory. And the British go on from that to develop amphibious techniques which are used by all the Allies, including the United States, in the months and years that follow. They develop a lot of the technology, they develop a lot of the designs for landing craft, for command ships, for attack transports, which become standard throughout the alliance in the next 3 or 4 years. And above all, I think they develop the joint organizations for coordinating the different forces that will take part, air, land, and sea. And these landings, I think, build up gradually over the next 2 or 3 years, and they are on the whole successful. Only one of them, Dieppe, could be called a defeat. At the same time, Britain is developing technologically in terms of naval systems, which we all know about. Ultra, Bletchley Park, code breaking are things which are developed largely on this side of the Atlantic. Much of modern radar is developed in Britain and first put into practice during the Battle of Britain. High frequency direction finding, very important in the war against the U-boats developed by the British. Radar control fighter direction, very important ultimately throughout the war on the Allied side, is developed by the British in 1940, on land in 1940, and then at sea in 1941. All of this is a sort of the development of ideas, and where America is so important is it proceeds from ideas to mass production, and it provides a lot of material which the British can't provide. But radar sets, radar communications, all kinds of sensors, aircraft, high technology are eventually developed alongside within the Great Alliance. The most important of the campaigns which come after the Battle of Britain and after the beginning of the let me just go back one there. No, okay. Of the beginning of the amphibious campaign is the Battle of the Atlantic, which lasts from, it's called a battle, but it lasts from 1940 until 1944. This is the ultimate result of the Battle of the Atlantic. Operation Deadlight surrendered German U-boats in Londonderry in June of 1945. The North Atlantic battles are largely fought by British and Canadian forces, British Empire forces. I would share the view of a number of naval historians that the battle with the U-boats was never such a near-run thing as is often depicted. Britain never actually faced a supply crisis in the end, but successfully maintaining Allied control of the North Atlantic required immense and decisive effort. The United States Navy did not play a hugely important role in the northern part of the North Atlantic, which is this key route which connects Britain with Canada and the European and the American Eastern Seaboard. American forces do play a major role in the Battle of the Atlantic after the middle of 1943, when American hunter-killer forces are deployed in the southern part of the North Atlantic. But by that time, I would argue that the back of the U-boat offensive has been broken in the north, and the southern part of the North Atlantic is the less important of the major convoy routes. Nevertheless, it's certainly after 1943, American Lend-Lease is very important in building up the Royal Navy. The arrival of large numbers of destroyer escorts built in the US is hugely important. Again, although I'm talking about the actual ASW work in the North Atlantic, the American warfare is enormously important in creating shipping. So although the British are never near going negative on their ship availability, at the end of 1942, production of Liberty ships and later Victory ships in American and Canadian yards is hugely important for actually maintaining what is crossing the Atlantic. And of course, by the time it gets to 1944, also what's crossing the Atlantic is an American expeditionary force going to bases in Britain. The war in the Mediterranean, sorry, just going back one step there. The war in the Atlantic also is, one must stress, a sea-air war. By 1942, aviation becomes far more important in the war, and the level of cooperation between the Allies is of huge importance. This is a kind of symbol of that. It's an airfield in Northern Ireland with a coastal command squadron flying Liberators, as you all know, equipped with anti-submarine radar. And I think this is this element, at least certainly in terms of equipment, the Battle of the Atlantic would not have been won without the long-range American aircraft and mass-produced radar equipment, which becomes available then. The Mediterranean is also an area where the British have a huge commitment. This is the surrender of the Italian fleet in 1943, after the surrender and the movement of the Italian Navy to Malta. It was transferred to Alexandria. And then into an anchorage in the Suez Canal, and this, I think, is the Vittorio Veneto, or from the bridge of the Vittorio Veneto with the Littorio, with the Italia, formerly Littorio, in front of it. And I think the ship in the lead is the Warspite. But it's symbolic of the end of the naval war in the Mediterranean, hugely important for the Royal Navy. It's a campaign which is largely supported by again, the British Merchant Navy. It's supplied around the Cape of Good Hope through the Indian Ocean, and it couldn't have happened had it not been for what comes in from outside through the Suez Canal. It's also, this is what Vince was talking about in the last talk. It's also very, very costly for Britain. It's the most costly of all the theaters in terms of heavy ships which the British fight in. Between 1940 and 1944, they lose a battleship, 2 fleet carriers, 16 cruisers, 57 destroyers, and 45 submarines. So it's an enormous struggle. It is largely on the Allied side a British warship effort. Just as in the Atlantic, only one major American warship is lost in action, which is the escort carrier Block Island in the Azores in 1944. So in the Mediterranean, as far as I know, only one American ship was seriously damaged, which was the Savannah, the light cruiser Savannah, sunk off Salerno not sunk, damaged off Salerno by a German flying bomb in 1944. But on the whole, most of the major ships involved are British. The American involvement both in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean is perhaps most heavy in 1942, but it's still, I would still say, relatively limited. Finally, the Indian Ocean is an area of British activity as well. Some people think that it prevented the Japanese and Germans from joining up. I don't altogether buy that, but I do think that the British played a major effort there. They were forced to move back from Singapore to Ceylon, and actually in 1942, from Ceylon back to the coast of West Africa. But it does involve a major deployment in 1943 and 44, mainly in a kind of anti-U-boat role. And in the Indian Ocean, only one major American warship is ever involved, which is, as you probably know, the cruise of the carrier Saratoga in 1944. So what I'm saying is that the British fleet is operational over a very large area and playing a very important part. As the British official naval historian Stephen Roskill put it, the British were, by 1942, trying to fight a 5-ocean war with, at best, a 2-ocean navy. And that's one of the reasons why, in the end, the Royal Navy was indeed unable to play more than a limited part in the war against Japan. But it was still the dominant warship force in the North and South Atlantic, in the Mediterranean. Ramsay, who was the naval commander. That operation was largely fought with British ships, and about half of the troops that landed were from the British side. The other half were American. The key thing after this, of course, is that when the follow-on forces land after D-Day, in the weeks and months that followed, that is largely an American effort. So finally, in conclusion, World War II was the swan song of Britain as a superpower. It was the end of British global maritime supremacy going back, which had existed for something like 200 years, but it was not the death altogether of a powerful navy. The British maritime effort during the war was large. Combat deaths in the Royal Navy and the US Navy were about the same, something like just above 60,000, 63,000 officers and men killed in action. The conflict was a war of two halves, with the break coming, I would argue, in late 1942. British maritime power and the Royal Navy played a uniquely powerful role in the first half of the war. And after that, British maritime power was still important. It still played a continued vital role alongside the maritime power of the United States. And they were both crucial for enabling the Allied victory globally in 1945. Thank you.
Well, Evan, thank you very much. I think that was quite a interesting presentation. I would like to open the floor to questions at this point, so people can feel free to go ahead and unmute if you do have a question that you would like to ask Evan. And as long as I have the floor, I think that I will exert my privilege and take the first question, if I may, or the first comment, if I will. I actually have several questions. You talked about how the persistence of air power, or how air power was such an important component in sea power, and perhaps the dominant component. And I'm curious what you have to say about the Royal Air Force control of coastal command, and whether you think that Britain's maritime needs would have been better served had the Navy controlled all maritime aspects of air power,
including coastal command.
well, especially
yeah.
Command.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the Navy also wanted coastal command, but it didn't succeed in getting that. I mean, coastal command expands enormously, and I think probably that in the British case, coastal command was probably a larger force than the U.S. Army Air Force ASW forces were. In the end, they were turned over to the Navy. But after quite a long struggle, partly because they're using the same aircraft, you know, the mostly Liberators, and who was going to control those assets. But yeah, definitely it would have been the case. I mean, there are three versions of this, right? There's the Japanese version, where the Japanese Navy controls everything, and which is kind of an ideal situation, but it does lead to a lot of redundancy. You know, you're producing different aircraft for the different services. I mean, I gather there were actually walls set up in some of the Japanese aircraft factories to keep the Navy and Army guys away from one another. You know, so that was also quite a dysfunctional thing. But I mean, it's interesting, by the way. If there's some very good comments by Admiral King about the British situation, and King holds the Fleet Air Arm in some contempt, at least as it was in the beginning of the war. And he says basically that's why we must never have service unity. You know, if we ever do that, then that's the end of naval aviation. You know, the Air Force will just kill it. And to some extent, I think that is true. It is remarkable what a weak position the Fleet Air Arm is in 1940. If the British had just had a good naval dive bomber, they would have probably controlled the Mediterranean from 1940 onwards. You know, they would have given them a huge advantage. Instead, they were fighting with antiquated aircraft until 1942, and then they're equipped by the Americans. They're much more effective, but it's, you know, by that time they've won the war for other reasons as well. So
one other comment I have to make before I surrender the floor here is that I would question your characterization of the Italian armistice in 1943 as being a fleet surrender. I think the fact that the Italians kept control of their warships, that they went ahead and were undertaking combat missions on behalf of the Allies that same month, argues that what happened is much more complex than a surrender. And I think that's a common misconception, especially in British histories. That's my comment.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I know what you're getting at, and it is a complicated thing. And again, it relates to what the Italian Navy knew was happening at the time. I think that's certainly a side to it. And if it's any, I mean, this may sound, I'm not being catty here, but I mean, the Italians were actually very effective at surrendering. I mean, they kept most of their fleet together in a way that maintained it intact. So from the institutional point of view, that can be seen as a success.
They just changed sides.
Yeah.
I had a couple things. First place, the United States government, president, and they all agree with you. They prioritized Europe over the Japanese from the start. So they fully agree with you. Those are the people on the ground. I think we've already addressed the RAF's preconceived notions having messed up the Royal Navy's aircraft. You mentioned the cooperation and amphibious ships. I know that the LCA, the British invented with the door on the front, was a great step forward. The US Marines copied the Japanese Daihatsu with the ramp and the LCVP. I don't know whether the Britain did as well. Truthfully, I just don't know. But I know that the US and Great Britain cooperated greatly, swapping ideas back and forth to the benefit of both.
Yeah, that's certainly true. The British actually copied the Japanese. I mean, the British saw what was happening on the coast of China in 1937, 1938, and they saw the first Japanese attack transport. They were very impressed. So whether it was a copy or not, I think they may have had bow ramps before that in earlier prototype landing craft. But they also developed the landing craft tank, which is important as it's between LSTs and smaller landing craft.
LCTs were all started in Britain, and the US jumped on that.
Sure, and LCIs were designed as raiding craft by the British. You know, the concept was built in Britain, in America, to British specification. They do develop the LST, the tank landing ship, but again, I think this is important because I mean they build about half a dozen of them, and the other 400 or 500 are built in U.S. inland shipyards. So the British have the idea, but the actual the wherewithal for a realistic continental invasion. I mean, both the invasion of Europe and laterally, Okinawa and preparing for the invasion of Japan would have been impossible without American production.
Thank you, Jim.
It was our cooperation that really made the whole thing work so well.
Let me give Carl a chance. So we have a lot of people here, and I think we have a lot of questions.
Thank you. Just an observation and a question. One observation I would like to make is an extension of your argument, Evan, about the innovative leadership that the Royal Navy had. I would suggest that extended into the first decade of the Cold War. So the Swan Song really could stretch out to the mid-1950s, particularly in innovations in ASW, and particularly in saving carrier aviation in the jet era with their three crucial technological breakthroughs: angled deck, steam catapult, and optical landing aids that allowed carrier aviation to flourish in the jet age. Maybe the Americans would have developed those things in the long run on their own, but frankly, it was British innovations well into the middle of the 1950s that really kept navies in the forefront in that first decade of the Cold War. So we do have to have an acknowledgement of the fact that the Royal Navy was still very much a critical innovator even after 1945. And then the question I have then is with your contention that the Atlantic, in a naval sense, was the critical theater in World War II, then how much of a setback, or at least a drag on Allied progress, was Admiral King's insistence on promoting the Pacific, even at the expense of the Atlantic in naval terms?
Well, I think it was significant. I mean, I think the Atlantic War was won without a huge amount of American help after 1942. I mean, clearly in the end, it all worked out for the best. I mean, you could argue that the Admiral King was right, and certainly you're talking about service traditions. You're talking about what can you do with a fleet of aircraft carriers and fast battleships in the Atlantic. There's actually no role for the kind of navy which the United States is building. So from that point of view, Admiral King, I think, is correct. The only might have been which one might consider in a very, very broad sense, is what would have happened if the Soviet Union had collapsed, before the Allies landed in Western Europe. That one could not know what the consequences of that would be. But in a sense, the decisions made by the United States in 1942 were going to put the landing in Northern Europe back to the middle of 1944. Which is quite late, and that was the kind of opportunity cost for the Pacific campaign. On the other hand, the Pacific campaign, as it works out, this is putting on my kind of 1944 hat, which is different. But what is astonishing is how fast that campaign is. It basically between June and it's kind of just putting your foot in the gas, and then suddenly you're halfway across the Pacific, or 2/3 of the way across the Pacific, and the Japanese are totally befuddled. They haven't had a chance to dig in, and certainly the Central Pacific campaign is after Tarawa is one which goes relatively easily. So I mean, on the one hand, I would say that Allied policy, not just American policy, was that the European front was more important. But Admiral King did get his way, and I think part of the reason for that was the Navy they had. What else can you do with the Navy in that situation? But I think in terms of, it wasn't so much in terms of carriers, in terms of shipping. How much shipping you were required, say, to invade the Marianas or the Philippines, or whatever, doing it at the same, what's so astonishing is that the invasion of Saipan comes at the same time as D-Day in the West. It just shows how strong the United States was at that time. So maybe anything's possible. Maybe that was the right thing to do. But on the other hand, it certainly goes against what the original intention of the war was.
What would have happened if we'd taken, for the sake of argument, 5 or 6 aircraft carriers and launched a major raid against, Saint Nazaire or some of the U-boat yards up there? Did what we've done in Japan. We had a major airstrike over a period of a day or two and withdrawn. How much would that have actually accomplished?
It might have worked. I mean, the U-boats were in hardened shelter, so whether that was possible or not, I don't know. Certainly in terms of American strategy in the 50s and 60s, with the idea of using carrier strikes against Murmansk and Russian bases, that would have been maybe a possibility. That involved nuclear weapons as well as conventional weapons. I mean, the issue is whether you could have actually carried out an invasion of Northern Europe supported by carriers. I mean, whether that would have been possible or not.
In 1942, yeah.
In 1943, well, 42. I think that was never possible in 1942. It was conceivable in 1943.
We're going to do 1942 invasion, I think, in August. So that'll be a topic.
Yeah.
Ralph Norton here. One comment. You asked what would have happened if the Soviet Union had collapsed. Planning was already underway for that. Remember, the original plan wasn't Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was Berlin and Nuremberg.
Yes, I mean, I understand that. This is the kind of Deus ex machina thing, that you've got this thing no one expects to happen, and whether that we all kind of sat back and waited for the nuclear bomb to arrive, not worry about anything else. But again, it's alternative history. You could argue that even if and I don't want to go there really. Well, I will go there, but I think that if the Soviet Union had been occupied by Germany, it wouldn't have mattered too much if someone dropped a bomb on well, it would be very hard to have dropped a bomb on Nuremberg anyway from the United States if you didn't control.
That's why the development of the B-36 design-wise actually started before Pearl Harbor. It would have been delay, but it would have happened.
No, I know that. Yeah, if you read the kind of secret war plan from 1941, they do mention the kind of how many types you would need, how many B-36s you would need. But I still think it would have been very hard to have destroyed Germany.
Agreed. Would have been
in 1943. And again, nuclear weapons don't become available until 1945.
Agreed. It would have been.
And the Germans could have developed nuclear weapons as well. So.
It would be in an Orwellian world, probably.
It would have been an Orwellian world indeed. Yep.
We
If
have
I,
more
I could speak, if I could
Rich,
speak
sure,
on,
yeah. Mhm.
speak on behalf of Admiral King, one of the things that bemused me was the British were, in fact, of course, very insistent that Europe is the decisive theater until the Japanese began approaching Australia and New Zealand. And suddenly it was help, 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 uh, you know, don't let them fall. It's sort of like uh, that becomes a huge factor. The other thing that people tend to forget is that when the Japanese kept pressing down to try to isolate Australia, they stepped on the shipping lanes, or potentially stepped on that, which I refer to as the sciatic nerve of the alliance, right? Because it took so much more shipping to do things in the Pacific than in the European theater. And if they were threatening that and threatening Australia, basically there had to be a response to that. It's not an option in terms of dealing strategically with the situation in 1942. And I cannot also fail to mention that it really Richard Overy, in his book How the Allies Won, I think he captured very brilliantly. He says, if you were living in the time, and in the spring of '92, the average person was asked, based upon what had happened in the war to date, how it was going to end, it had been impossible to predict the Allied triumph of that magnitude that have actually took place at the end. So things were very touch and go up to that point. We shouldn't forget the contingency of events, at least through 1942.
I think it's also really important to see things as people saw it at the time. That we have hindsight and people don't. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone was agreed that it was important to, in fact, almost from the very beginning of the war, the Americans are laying out the supply line to Australia. I mean, and everyone agrees it's very important. I mean, the Japanese didn't actually intend to invade Australia, but no one actually knows that. But I completely agree with you. But I think the disagreement was yeah, we want to capture Rabaul, but after that, really, do we need a Central Pacific campaign? We've once we hold or we've encircled Rabaul, once we're in New Guinea, there's no way in which the Allies are going to cut the supply line to Australia. So let's get on with the war in Europe and not devote forces to another theater. But I think going against that, and again in defense of Admiral King, is that we are building this huge navy that can only be used in one place. We can't use it in Europe. So in a way, almost the technology, the shipbuilding industry is what's driving things rather than just poor old Admiral King.
And also, the American public would never have tolerated the notion we're going to stand fast in the Pacific for a couple of years while we settle up with Germany. That was not on the cards.
Yes, I think that's right.
I don't agree that the American Navy would have been useless in the Atlantic. I think it could have provided considerable force in a lot of places, and its mobility would have been a real concern for Germany. It could have raised holy hell with Norway in 42 or 43, which is what Germany was using to get submarines and ships out. So there are possibilities to use it.
Well, I think the big bump in terms of the American Navy, right? The big bump comes in the last months of 1943. Those ships couldn't have been used because they didn't exist yet. Mm-hmm. So what happens in 1942, in my view, is that essentially the old Navy is largely wiped out. The U.S. Navy, anyway, is not wiped out, but the carrier force
rebuilding
doesn't exist anymore, right? So what is happening is you've got, by the middle of 1944, you've got 6 or 7, Essex fleet carriers, 9 Independence class. You actually, you suddenly have got this huge Navy, 400 or 500 aircraft being carried. I mean, that's not available until quite late on. So I don't think that could have been used in Europe in 1943. The smaller forces available that survived the Solomons could have been used in Europe in 1943.
I think I saw a question did you have a question, Daniela? You're muted, so you have to unmute.
Okay, and not a question, but just a remark. It's interesting, and I was thinking the importance that the British gave to the Mediterranean theater, because not in itself the Mediterranean, but the south of Caucasus and the oil field. And Winston Churchill, he knew he was a maritime man. He knew exactly that was the strategic defense to maintain to defend Russia from the south, and in order not to lose the oil field in the Caucasian region, which was from the continent the strategic objective for Operation Blue, which ended in Stalingrad. So the British knew well that was a strategic theater to fight, and that's why they were very much involved with a lot of ships, and there was a major theater, a major I would say war in a war fought during the Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's seen as very important. And what is astonishing is, I think anyway, is that during the Battle of Britain, when in theory, everyone, it's all backs to the wall and we're all about to be invaded by the Germans, they send a large fleet. They send fleets to attack former French colonies and to reinforce the navy in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, the British are always seeing things on a kind of global scale, and they're not actually that worried about invasion. In terms of the, I mean, with my other hat on, I mean, I'm also an historian of the Russian front as well. I think the point about the oil is that one must remember that what's really important for oil is Venezuela and the Caribbean. That's where the oil comes from the Allied naval point of view. It may be valuable to deprive Germany of oil for the Wehrmacht, and that's absolutely true. But it isn't one that's so important from the Allied side.
Actually, can I ask a question around that? Can you speak to the relative importance of Caribbean oil versus the oil fields in Iraq? I was always under the impression that the Middle Eastern oil fields were far more important to the British Empire than the Caribbean, but I could be wrong.
No, it's Caribbean. The Caribbean is far more important than, as I understand it, in terms of oil produced. And I mean, even the Dutch East Indies aren't terribly, they're not huge oil fields for. By global standards. Then I think, as I understand it, to some extent, the Iraq was used to provide some oil for the Middle East.
It was local oil mostly. Middle East was for local uses.
Yeah.
Well, but there was a pipeline from Iraq, from Kirkuk to Haifa, and where there was a refinery, and that's where they got a lot of their fuel for the 8th Army in Egypt, in the Western Desert, was through that.
Ralph,
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
I spent 45 years in the oil business and worked in all the refineries you're talking about as a consultant. The Caribbean refineries were major, along with Gulf Coast US. Haifa, again, I've worked there. That was fuel oil production, some gasoline, not aviation fuel, until the refinery in Bahrain was constructed to support the invasion of Japan, though it never started up for a few years. There was no major aviation fuel production in the Middle East. All came out of the Caribbean.
So could you just clarify that? It's developing in Bahrain. They were developing a refinery in Bahrain with a view to supplying the Far East.
Yes.
Against Japan.
Cracker plant, alkylation unit there. Company design I worked for that would have world class, would have supplied aviation gasoline to the Far East. So
right.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was ready to come online in mid 45 and it got bottled up for many years. But no, the Caribbean was the major thing. And remember, fuel oil's easy to produce. Anyone with a backyard still can make that. Making aviation fuel and high octane gasoline and good quality diesel, that's the hard part. Those came out of the Gulf Coast and some refineries in New Jersey and the Caribbean. Yes.
Thank you, Ralph.
Yep.
I was just going to mention, in view of what Ralph said, that one of the major things delivered to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, and that's frequently overlooked, was high octane aviation fuel, which they didn't have the capability to make, in the Soviet Union in the quantities they needed.
Right. Or the company I worked for actually built a packaged unit to make aviation fuel and shipped it to Russia. by the North Sea, by going around Murmansk. Again, it was not ready until 45, 46, but they copied that technology for the next 30 years. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too. I know I didn't know it was by the North Sea, but I know towards the end of the war, I don't know if it was the Americans or the British or both, sent a refinery, basically, package
Yep.
to the Soviet Union.
Google Universal Oil Products. You'll find a history of that.
I would say that one of the things that I'm really interested in at the moment is bases and oil shipments, especially the supplies of the fast task forces, replenishment at sea, that kind of thing. Because I think one of the most astonishing things about the campaign in the Central Pacific is how fast it moves, but also the fact that those carriers are at sea for very long periods of time, and that they develop forward bases in places like Majuro very quickly, I think faster than they actually intended to. In the original plan for taking the Marshalls, Kwajalein is going to be the main base, and Majuro is kind of a stepping stone, a minor air base. But they actually create very large air bases there, and certainly throughout the rest of 1944, they're operating from the Marshalls.
So,
No one goes back to Hawaii. So, and that logistic effort, it's just astonishing.
and it all came out of the West Coast. There were refinery major construction out here, 41, 42, 43, to produce much increase in high quality aviation gasoline and the like. And I've worked in some of those units that are still running with much modification, but they're still running. If you ever want to know about the technology, you rattle my cage.
Yeah, it sounds good. You've tempted me.
I'd like to make a couple of comments. First of all, I just agree with you that the Atlantic theater was the more important maritime struggle of the Second World War. And that's true for no other reason that Germany was the greater threat. That was understood at the time by leaders. I think most historians at the time look back and realize that's the case. But it's also just obvious from the events that occurred. It took the combined strength of the United States, the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and to a large extent, the United States to be able to defeat Germany. And as far as America was concerned, we had the Germany first policy. Majority of American Army forces actually ended up over in Europe. The majority of the Air Force over there. It was only the Navy that really, didn't follow that policy. It took all of that to defeat Germany. Japan was basically defeated in Japan, we were going to defeat when we had time to do it. We basically brought Japan to their knees, the United States alone, in about the same amount of time it took to defeat Germany. So I think it's clear that Germany was the greater threat. If we hadn't had success in the Atlantic theater, we wouldn't have had success in Europe, other than maybe some scenario like we were talking earlier about dropping, nuclear bombs on Berlin. Second issue, I just want to throw out real quick, because we were talking before. And again, I'm not necessarily critical of a decision of the United States to put the bulk of its naval effort into the Pacific, but I just want to point out that the greatest maritime debacle in American U.S. history was on the American Eastern Seaboard in the summer of, or in the beginning of 1942, with Operation Drumbeat and the terrible losses that we sustained there. And that's something that we tend to just kind of gloss over. We don't really want to think about Operation Drumbeat and the carnage that occurred on the American seaboard. And a lot of that is laid at the feet of Admiral King. So, for whatever it's worth, I just wanted to throw that into the conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Evan and I have actually been emailing back and forth about Drumbeat. I actually feel that King is given a bum rap for that. I don't think he deserves a very good grade for that, but I certainly don't think he deserves a failing grade. There were a lot of balls that had to be juggled simultaneously at that point in time. And frankly, too, the British were also creating naval obligations for the U.S. fleet when they would go and, hey, we're going to go invade Madagascar. Would you mind covering the Atlantic for us while you're gone? So I think it's a very complex issue. And I am not in the camp that says that, King was 100% at fault at this. There were a lot of things going on there that were sucking away escorts. and that were unavoidable.
We didn't have all of the stuff, the aircraft or the ships to run that. My dad was an intelligence officer on the East Coast then, and he used to call King Smiling Jack.
Yeah, I think
Back to smile.
I think the yeah, I mean, I understand what John's talking about, and we have discussed this. I'm not that far away from him. I think the other remarkable failure is the Army Air Force. You know, if you compare the British experience of Coastal Command and the Army Air Force, the fact that there aren't any German U-boats operating within 300 miles of the UK coast because of Coastal Command in 1943-44. I think they come inshore later on, but the Coastal Command has been able to drive them out into the mid-Atlantic. Why that didn't happen on the U.S. East Coast, I don't know, in 1942. I think more could have been done there anyway.
I think it's, again, I'm not trying to say that Admiral King was solely responsible for what happened off the Eastern Seaboard. There was a lot of considerations, and you can talk about, there were just, we obviously didn't react. And there were a lot of simple things we could have done immediately, like immediately instituted some type of convoys instead of basically opposing that. Immediately, instituted blackouts. Immediately, we were basically operating under peacetime conditions, and the Germans took advantage of that. And I only threw this into the conversation just because this is a piece of American naval history that, by and large, like I said, it was arguably the greatest feat that in American naval history, and it's something that is basically ignored to a very large extent.
Vince, Don Patton, can I jump in?
Sure, Don, jump.
A year and a half ago, I led a battlefield tour. We did the 75th anniversary of Normandy. We then went down to Lorient and Saint Nazaire. But one of the things that occurred to me, we spent, I think, 3 days in Lorient, went through the sub base there. But when the tide was low, most of the ships were bottomed out. They were sitting in mud in there. And I know that there was a great effort by the 8th Air Force to bomb Lorient. They actually did one of the big bombs and did some destruction there. But it seems to me that we lost a lot of planes bombing that. And I'm wondering if it would not have, but because of the tides there and the restrictions that would have been on the German submarines coming in and out, why couldn't they have just dropped mines at the inlet at strategic times rather than trying to bomb the sub pens? Again, I am not a naval expert, but it looks like they put huge efforts, lost a lot of planes and men just for the glory of the 8th Air Force, where they could have done, I think much like they did in Vietnam War, dropping mines in the naval harbors and restricted the submarines in and out. Any of you naval experts comment?
Well, we did that to the Japanese during World War II. I wonder the same thing.
Well, they did have a mining campaign. It was predominantly run by the Royal Air Force, and it was predominantly Bomber Command that actually did it. And it wasn't just target. They did mine the ports of the Bay of Biscay, but they also had extensively, into Northern Europe and the Baltic. They were trying to impede the flow of iron ore from Norway and Sweden into Germany. But there was an aerial mining campaign that was very extensive, and it was actually carried out by Bomber Command predominantly.
My comment was Lorient.
Right, but those areas were also targeted as well. The Germans had a very extensive mine sweeping service that was constantly, the Allies, predominantly the British, would lay the mines, and the Germans would sweep the mines, and it was a constant. I mean, they laid tens of thousands of mines, and one of the things, like to kind of parrot, something that Evan was talking about earlier, when you're talking about the sea-air war, is I think an interesting fact is that the Royal Air Force was actually responsible for the destruction of more German ships during World War II than the Navy was. And Bomber Command by itself was responsible for the destruction of about 1,100 German ships. We're talking predominantly surface ships, but this did include some U-boats as well. That was through predominantly mine laying, but also attacks against ports. The United States 8th Air Force was responsible for, I think, 300, 400, 500 ships that were destroyed. Coastal Command Strike Wings was responsible for 400 plus ships that were destroyed. So this very much was a air-sea conflict, as Evan points out. That's why I never refer to it as a naval conflict. I always refer to it as a maritime conflict because there was such a great air component of this. But as far as the mining campaign was concerned, there was an extensive mining campaign. America wasn't involved in it, but it was overwhelmingly a British-run operation that was carried out by Bomber Command.
Well, I haven't visited. I think there were 5 between Brest, Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, Bordeaux, and I'm probably missing one there somewhere on the French coast. But my observation specifically, and of course that's what they actually did at Saint-Nazaire, is they tried to bomb the docks, or that was a bombing operation. But the limited study that I've done of some of the other submarine bases, there was kind of a narrow inlet getting into a harbor that could have been the target for bombing or mining or whatever, rather than these huge concrete structures that they used for basing and repairing their submarines.
Well,
Yeah, they didn't bomb one of the major mistakes was not bombing those structures when they were being built. They weren't attacked until they were completed. But if they had been attacked in the kind of intermediaries, in the building stage, they would have been more successful. I would say, by the way, this question about bombing heavy bombers and naval forces and sea air war, I've never seen a book about heavy bombers versus ships, an attempt to really tie that together. Because it seems to me, I used to think it was, heavy. It was sort of the Midway thing that bombers never hit. It was a kind of Air Force con that they claimed all these victories that they didn't actually achieve. But in fact, bombers are very effective about ships in port. When ships aren't moving or attacking island airfields, bombers can be exceptionally effective. And in the Mediterranean, I think in particular, the Army Air Force played quite a large role in destroying Italian warships in port, using heavy bombers. So I don't think it's ever been looked at. I mean, the Tirpitz is the obvious case that everyone knows about, but a number of other major German warships were sunk in April 1945 using very heavy bombs. So it was actually a remarkably successful technique. I'm also very impressed by my knowledge of the Marianas campaign. Well, the Central Pacific was relatively limited when I started, but certainly aircraft operating for the admiralties from the southern part of from the area of northern New Guinea, the admiralties from Bougainville play really a very large role in neutralizing. This is liberators attacking Japanese air bases in the Marshalls and the Gilberts play really quite an important part. Also attacking Truk.
Well,
but to answer your question, anyway. Hello?
Go ahead.
Can I ask you? Oh, sorry.
Okay, I have some questions for Evan, but just to answer this discussion, at the time, bombing was very inaccurate. In order to get a mine into a channel required tremendous load from a logistics point of view. I think Jim Fitzsimons in one of the talks we had in the series said, I think his research indicated it took 1,300 pieces of ordnance dropped to actually hit a target in many of these situations. So when you're talking about narrow channels being mining, the bomber has to get them that narrow channel. And to do that, it would seem that they practically have to drop their entire load on top of one spot to get one mine in that. We tend to look at bombing based on current capabilities. And in World War II, bombing was incredibly ineffective. Yes, you could hit a ship in a harbor, but you had to have many bombers dropping multiple loads in order to achieve decisive hits. And that's something we tend to forget. One of the many attacks in the Pacific by land-based aviation achieved very little against moving ships because it was so hard to hit them. Same thing with carrier aviation. It was very hard to hit them. And you had to have tremendous amounts of ordnance. And that's what the US could do that others didn't. But having answered that, I just want to talk to Evan. Very provocative presentation. Enjoyed it a lot. Would like to poke back a little bit because the way you presented things would, from the net assessment point of view, would make me conclude that there's no reason the British Empire shouldn't be standing today since it had so much power. But it seems to me that in the span of the war, Britain suffered some very severe reverses. It was driven out of Norway. It was driven out of Greece. Some experts claim that the force in Singapore, British force that surrendered to a smaller Japanese force. Was there something bloody wrong with the British generals and admirals that day? Why was this power that you've described in the beginning that had so much advantages, it would seem, to retain itself as a global power, why was it having so much trouble that it had to rely on the United States? And I will be more provocative and say one more comment, that there were three forces that wanted to see the end of the British Empire by the end of the war. Stalin, number one, even more than Hitler, and then probably FDR. So anyway.
That's totally true. I mean, I completely agree with that. I think that, you could argue that actually the war is about the British Empire. I mean, that's what it's really about. In that, as you say, that's what everyone actually wants. They want to destroy the British Empire. They want a chunk of the British Empire. So, I mean, what appears to be a great strength is actually a considerable weakness, because you can't be everywhere. And what happens in 1940 is a kind of perfect storm, when, I mean, for reasons that are out with the control of the British, a fall of France, for example. They are in a very exposed position. David Edgerton, who's written a number of good books on the British economy and is a major anti-declinist, argues that the real problem for the British was the fall of Malaya. It wasn't the fall of France. It was the loss of those resources. Britain could do without France. It could even do without the Middle East, but it couldn't do without Malaya. Or it was much harder. Rubber, oil, all those things were really important. So I would say that I don't have I don't think the British Empire is kind of a pyramid game, right? I mean, it's like building on betting on a margin, So basically, you defend India by using Indian troops. You defend Malaya by using Indian troops. Okay, so as long as it doesn't go too far, you actually can do that. But once things do begin to collapse, then things can go very, very badly indeed. And they do need the United States in order to provide the resources to hold out. Certainly, I mean that's right. But I mean, and as you say, I would say that the British lose the war. I mean, obviously they win the war at one level, but they lose the empire. I mean, I think the Russians lost the war as well. In the same way, the war was extremely costly for Russia, and they didn't get a lot for it. What they got was an indefensible empire, and they were kind of locked into a model of Russian national defense, which was, forgot the consumer and forgot, modernization of civilian industry. The kind of things that can allow you to win wars can make you lose the peace. And I think that happened in the British case. It's surprising how fast the British Empire collapsed, actually, if you think about it. You know, between between Singapore and Suez, or maybe even between Singapore and 1945, you know, or 1947. Okay, but once India goes, really the whole rationale for the empire goes as well. I wouldn't actually forget the nuclear dimension, by the way. I think, you know, the rise of Russia as a nuclear power, and the nature of modern war is another thing which I think affects the empire.
Thank you.
Excuse me, this is Doug in San Diego. Sam Tangretti mentioned sometimes about China's role. And then one of the reasons that I tuned into you today was to look at what possible lessons could we and naval leaders learn from the research you've done about China, or about Great Britain's swan song that could lead in the next 10 to 15 years a swan song for the American Navy, very similar, maybe not with a war involved because of the nature of war nowadays, but are there things that we could learn from that would say, be prepared now. You have to be aware of these kinds of things that Britain didn't pay attention to, and that's why they are no longer a power.
Yeah, I mean, some things you can deal with, some things you can't. I mean, the problem for Britain was partly the development of regional powers that were capable in Japan, in Germany, in the United States, were capable of developing their economies as rapidly as Britain had done in the 19th century. And that's sort of the situation. I don't want to get into modern politics really, because I'll just be sharing my ignorance, okay? But just so if I say anything, just don't take it very seriously. But I think what you could say is, what do the Chinese have to learn from what happened in the Second World War? And there isn't a lot about China in this book, right? In my book, and one of the facts that's true is that the reason why China ended up being invaded was didn't have a navy. I mean, China was basically a victim of Japanese aggression because it didn't have a navy. It had no way of defending itself. So I think. And in fact, you know, the invasion of China by Japan wouldn't have been possible without Japan holding the ports. You know, they do that very quickly. So I mean, there are lessons there for the Chinese. For the Americans, I mean, I know there's this whole debate about, you know, sea denial and you know, carriers being attacked by Chinese missiles, and we know whether you actually can deploy into the Western Pacific or not. I mean, that's true, but I mean, I don't think it's the case that that kind of change would happen anytime soon from the American point of view. America has such a major lead that I don't think it would lose it any quickly, but I don't see it could necessarily be able to defend Taiwan under certain conditions, you know, but that's kind of always been the case. I mean, and that would certainly be the case if China, you know, as inevitably China became stronger. So it's difficult, but I don't know. I mean, do you have a view on that yourself on how to respond?
Well, I'm reading some books on China now, and of course the WNHA has been talking about Chinese naval growth. So my opinion was that there's an awful lot of things that the Chinese are doing now and building up their strength on that. And then I'm trying to look at the strategic things that our planners ought to be thinking about in terms of this warfighting capability. The Naval Institute proceedings just came out this month addressing that issue about the whole surface warfare aspect of that. So I know that there seems to be a lot of strategic thinking going on, and I don't know what the Naval War College is doing too, but it seems like there are a lot of people in our Navy defense organization that are starting to say, you know, we have to think back to the lessons of World War II and what were they specifically, the general strategic lessons on it. It's probably beyond the scope of this particular presentation, but you certainly lit a fire. Thank you.
This is Terry McCurney. Well, my quick observation on the last one relative to the context of World War II and an anti-Chinese strategy now, and that is the South China Sea is not the Solomon, so be careful how we make that how we make analogies there. And I'm sorry that Richard Frank dropped off before we kind of got into that. But But Evan, you opened to this issue, so I'm going to maybe be unfair a bit. You started out with a picture of the new Queen Elizabeth. So maybe not so much as a historian, but maybe as a British citizen, tell me what you think about the way there's this resurgence of Royal Navy capability and a new look in the Royal Navy and a new place in the world, if you will, for them.
Well, the Queen Elizabeth was built about half a mile from where I'm sitting right now. I mean, the modules were put together on the Clyde, and they were shipped to Rosyth to assemble them. So I have a kind of close connection with the project. And as I was saying, they kind of got it all together in January, just a week ago, when their carrier strike group became operational. They have built 2 carriers. I am uncertain as to whether that was a sound decision to make, to try to build a large carrier fleet. And again, this is not in my general area of expertise, but I do think that the problem is that the technologies are changing so rapidly that it's very hard to know, what should one do. So when the carriers were first conceived, they were fast jet, they were F-35 C carriers, the carrier version, and what?
The conventional takeoff landing.
Yeah, conventional. That's right. And they're now F-35Bs. I mean, there is at the moment with the present government talks about global Britain. The Britain is not a member of the European Union anymore, and it's got a kind of it can do. It can have a different kind of role, and in the absolute abstract, well, you could argue that having carrier task forces is part of that, but it's an enormous chunk of the defense budget to have ships of that size, and the original operational requirement for them came in the 1990s. It's hard to see what actually inspired them, except maybe the war in Kosovo, the idea that you could project forces from carriers. But I mean, how Britain could use those carriers in any effective way, it's hard to, I find personally hard to understand. I think one might see it as you build carriers in the same reason that you have atomic weapons, so that you're alliance worthy, that you can play a part with another major power, with the United States, and you can contribute to that. And the United States will also cooperate in what your objectives are. But as a freestanding global carrier force, I have some reservations about how effective that's going to be and how sustainable that will be. Britain is trying to do an awful lot, and there's a large black hole in the defense budget.
We're kind of getting away from the original topic of the presentation.
Sorry.
Well, no, that's not a problem.
My fault.
Part of the part of the charm of these presentations. I'm a little more concerned about time here, so I would like to give anybody who has not had an opportunity to ask a question that opportunity. I think the first hand I see up is Mr. Stern.
Yes, I'd like to go back to a subject that got passed over very quickly early on in Evan's presentation, and that was the relationship between King and his particular interest in the Pacific, and whether that delayed D-Day from 1943 until 1944. And I just wonder if there is really honestly any possibility that D-Day could have occurred in 1943, given that the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't decisively won until May of 43. Shipping any large American expeditionary force across to Great Britain as a staging base to the continent of Europe could not have really gotten underway in any serious manner until mid-43. Is it really possible that what King did delayed D-Day?
I think I mean, certainly Admiral King argued that since there's no chance that we can invade Europe in 1943, why should we waste resources fighting in Europe until we're ready to do it? You know, there's no point in standing still in the Pacific when we're also standing still in Europe. You know, so the argument was that if nothing's happening there, then we shouldn't waste resources.
To me,
On
that's
the other hand,
an argument.
on the other hand, it is the case that the Allies become involved in a major land war in Italy in 1943, which was a peripheral theater. And conceivably, I'm not arguing this as I'm just sort of running this through my head at the moment, but conceivably, I mean, it was possible to send an expeditionary force across the Atlantic, only it went to Italy rather than going to northern France. And it is actually, you have to bear in mind that the Soviet Union is also fighting in this war, and that most of the German army is tied up in Russia. So I mean, I didn't think it's inconceivable that an invasion of Northwest Europe could have been carried out in 1943 if there had not been an invasion of involvement in the Mediterranean. Now, that's the British fault. I mean, it was the British who said, well, yeah, we're not going to go for northern France now. We're actually going to go for Italy because we favor a kind of encirclement strategy, you know, rather than getting involved in some bloodbath in France, which will cost us losses on the scale of the First World War. And Marshall doesn't like that. Marshall actually is a kind of straightforward kind of guy. Goes for, go for the jugular and land in France as soon as you can, and directly into the German heartland. I think that probably that was impractical, but I'm not certain. I mean, because just given how the limitations on German power and the fact that by the beginning of 1943, Germany is already beginning to retreat. It's pretty clear that the war in Russia is not going to be lost by the Russians. And Germany's not going to win there, and there's now a war of attrition going on. So I'm not really sure. Maybe
if I can jump in. I want to remind you that there were two convoys in November of 1942 that crossed the Atlantic. One from Hampton Roads, another one from the Clyde, all the way to North Africa, and neither one was touched by any submarine intervention.
And that was very lucky.
Well, no, they weren't lucky. They pretty much knew where the situation was, and I think if you study that a little bit, you'll see that the U-boat threat was not anywhere near as dangerous as it's commonly portrayed. And the second comment, I'm just hanging that out there, is that we will be talking about this subject next year. Or this year, actually, it's 2021. So that will be the topic, I think, for an August Q&A, and we can go into it in much greater depth at that point.
I just want to say the one thing that most people don't take into account when you talk about 1943 is that Germany had, I think, Evan, you alluded to this, they were totally focused on the Eastern Front. They had all their Panzer divisions and their tanks there, other than the few they had in Italy. In July of 1943, they had one Panzer division in Western Europe and 27 infantry divisions. By D-Day, there were 8 Panzer divisions and a Panzer Grenadier division, and 40 some. There was a total of 59 divisions in the West. So you're talking about a completely different task in 1943 as opposed to 1944. So that relates to the question of getting resources over there. And I think I'd also like to point out, just touching upon what Vince just said, I do believe the number of American troops that were lost at sea crossing the Atlantic because of U-boat losses is 0 during World War II.
It is. Are there more questions for Evan? We're starting to impinge upon the time limits here, so I would
have one.
Welcome anybody else who wants to ask a question. Carlos.
Yes, I have a question. It's related with your title anyway. Swan Song. What happened to the British merchant marine and the carrying trade after the end of the war? Did it decline as well?
I'm sorry, what happened to what? I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry, the British merchant marine and the carrying trade?
In the what? In the
Carrying
which trade?
The trade.
Oh,
Shipbuilding.
trade, yeah. Well, again, I live in Glasgow, which is heavily, it's both post-industrial and post-maritime, and it used to be where I am. If I were to turn around and walk for half a mile, I'd be at the river, and there were probably 15 major shipyards still in the 1950s, and they're not there anymore. But I mean that kind of deindustrialization is not that uncommon in the developed world. Glasgow's kind of like Pittsburgh, in some respects. So, but that trade actually booms in the late 40s, early 50s. There's partly because there's a lack of, Germany and Japan don't have merchant navies anymore, and they're not producing very much. British trade is pretty buoyant. So things are okay then, and then by the late 50s, the merchant navy is becoming smaller and smaller, and shipbuilding in the UK is becoming increasingly expensive. So a lot of what is built is regional shipping or warships. So by the time you get into the 60s, Britain in some respect isn't a maritime nation anymore. I mean, it's odd, that this is true everywhere, but on the whole, shipping is invisible. I mean, the globalization's going on, but there's no sense. The way it's carried out is it's not. You're not seeing it happening in front of you, and as you would have in the second picture slide I showed was London in the 1930s. That kind of thing doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you, Evan. I think this has been a really interesting Q&A, and I will also point out that it's been our most well-attended Q&A, so obviously you have some star power here, so we appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody who's come and listened so long. And with that, I think it's probably time to wrap it up unless anybody wants one last word.
I just say stay well. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. I gather it's bad in Southern California. It's still bad here. Just take care of yourselves, isolate, wear masks, be careful.
Yes, that's all good advice. And thank you everybody who has come. And next month, we'll be featuring a talk by Daniel Rogers, who will be talking about, Daniel, what are you going to be talking about?
The title is Was Terror Necessary? We'll have plenty of room for people to bring in their perspectives on the Pacific War and engage in more alternative history if they want.
Well, we're looking forward to that. We're kind of going from the macro to the micro in one fell swoop here. So that's kind of a good change of pace, I think.
That's good study of history.
It is. It is. So thank you all, and we will hopefully see you all next month.